Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the closed alpha for For Honor. This is an upcoming game by Ubisoft Montreal that is going to be released in February of next year for PC, Xbox One, and PS4. What you're seeing here is, of course, the PC version. And, of course, I do have to remind you that this is an alpha, so pretty much everything could change pretty dramatically by the time the game actually comes out. Hopefully they'll have some beta periods that will go along with this that will allow us to take a look at the game as it progresses as well. But this closed alpha was actually the first time the public at large could really start to get their hands on the game itself and try it out for themselves. And this actually had become one of my most anticipated titles for this year until they bumped it back to next year. I was pretty mad about that, actually, because this was one of the very few titles I was actually looking forward to this year. But whatever, I'd rather them take the time to actually put in some more development there to make sure that everything gets sorted out by the time the game comes out, rather than just rush it out and it being another Rainbow Six Siege situation where the game isn't really good until several months in. But we'll of course see how that turns out. What really matters in this particular video is how the game is in its current state as of the closed alpha version. Well, it is still an alpha, so there are a bunch of things they're still working on, but as far as presentation goes, this game looks pretty good. There's a lot of detail in the modeling, the animations are generally very smooth and fluid, the environments are generally rather well detailed, and there's actually a fair bit of customization options for the various characters, although they really are kind of weak in their current state. Could just be because the game isn't finished yet and they're still working on the final implementation, but as it stands, there are a few things you can mess around with to tailor the various characters to your liking. Now, apart from some graphical glitches and some UI elements that really need to be made a bit more user-friendly and make actually more sense, they also need to work on the texture quality, because it's decent, but there are quite a few textures that are fairly low res, and they do kind of clash with everything going on around you. So it would be nice if they could bump up the texture quality, particularly for the PC release. But that could again just be because the game isn't finished yet, so they may just not have the high-res texture pack or anything like that available. I mean, the closed alpha version doesn't even have full screen support. It's only windowed or borderless window, so they did definitely hold back the graphics quite a bit for this alpha version, so we'll see how that turns out in the full game. On the sound side of things, you've got voice acting that consists basically of grunts and yells and the multiplayer component, so there's really not much to talk about there. But when you get to the sound effects and the music, you find that while the sound effects themselves are fairly hard-hitting and work very well, the music is lackluster. It's nothing that's particularly memorable, at least from what we've seen so far. There could be certain tracks in the game that are in the full version that are better, but as it stands, what we've got in the alpha version is fairly forgettable. It does, however, fit in with the theme that they're going for, which is that medieval combat, so at least it works on that front. But of course what really matters here is the gameplay, because the story is not in the alpha version. That's something that they're going to be putting into the full release, but we don't have anything here, it's just multiplayer component. So the main questions there revolve around the actual game modes, the matchmaking, and the melee combat system that they've got going on for this thing, which they refer to as the Art of Battle system. Now I'll start with the game modes themselves. There are 3 available in the alpha. Those are Duel, which is just a 1v1 fight that is best of 5 rounds. There's Brawl, which is a 2v2 fight that is best of 5 rounds. And then there is Dominion, where you and 3 other players square off against either a team of all AIs or a team of other players, and you compete over various points on the map. There are 2 points where it's just a matter of capturing it, sort of like in a domination mode. And then the third point is the front, where you have a bunch of minions duking it out, and either you or the enemy team can capture that point based on whoever is holding that particular point at any given time in terms of numbers. And you can help your team out by going into that area and smacking around the minions for the other team. Now you don't need to lock on to the minions themselves to smack them around. They all die on one hit, and that's whether you're using heavy attacks or light attacks, so it doesn't matter what you're using as long as you can just go in and smack them around a bit until eventually your team captures the point. When you capture a point, you get 100 points for your team, and then you get a trickle as well. And as you stand on a point and hold it, if you're not contested anyway, you actually increase the rate at which you can gather points. But the thing is, you have to be careful, because if the enemy team takes one of your points, then you lose the 100 points that you had gained from it, they get the 100 points, and then they also get that trickle rate as well. And once you hit 1,000 points accumulated for your team, the enemy team enters a state called breaking, where they will no longer respawn upon death. So at that point, you're supposed to wipe out all 4 of the enemy's heroes, in which case you will win the match. The thing is that both teams can actually be in this state at the same time as long as they have over 1,000 points. So you do need to be very careful with that and make sure that you don't give the enemy an opportunity to just drain your points and then get the 1,000 points they need to send you into breaking and then just annihilate you. It's a mode that allows a lot of back and forth, because as long as you can keep the enemy team from getting 1,000 points, you have a fighting chance. And even if you do manage to get to the point where the enemy team has 1,000 points, as long as you're close enough, you can actually turn the tables on them and get that 1,000 points that you need to send them into breaking and then take them out. And when you get into a situation where it is that sort of back and forth, it actually becomes pretty exciting to play. What's less exciting is the implications this has for the Art of Battle system, which is really built entirely around one thing and one thing only: one-on-one melee combat. And for that, they actually did a very good job of it. You have 3 directions that you can adjust your guard in, and each character has their own specific strengths and weaknesses to use. For example, the Orochi that you see me playing a lot in the footage here actually doesn't maintain a guard at all times like the Warden does, for example. Instead, you have to react immediately to an incoming strike and just time it just right. And that's a trait for all of the characters within that particular class, which is the Assassin class. They actually do not get a guard to constantly maintain. They always have to react to incoming hits, which means they're harder to play. On the other hand, the Heavy class and the Vanguard class actually have maintained guards, so they hold their weapons in the particular guard location that you have set for them, meaning that you can actually passively block instead of having to actively block like you do with the Assassin class. Now, to facilitate the actual combat system, you have to select a guard, and then you can either hit the light attack or the heavy attack button. The heavy attack has a fairly long wind-up, and it's pretty easy to deflect if you know what you're doing, but the trade-off there is that they do quite a bit more damage, and if you manage to finish off an enemy with a heavy attack, you can then go into an execution, which forces them into a respawn instead of allowing their teammates to come up and revive them. So you need to be careful of what you're doing there, whether you finish them off with a light attack or a heavy attack, and whether you finish them off with an execution or not, because the execution is an uninterruptible animation that you do need to go through, so you do need to pay attention to that. That said, those are pretty satisfying. In fact, this includes the only instance I can think of a Mordhau being used in any video game context ever, and it's as an execution, but hey, it's in the game. I mean, the animation they've gone for with that execution isn't really what a Mordhau's for. It's really more to bash somebody senseless who's in armor, but whatever. Point is, they've managed to actually include some real martial techniques in with the animations, and it lends the combat a sense of weight and authenticity that most other melee games don't have. And when you move past the animations themselves and the fact that there's light and heavy attacks, there's also a guard break button where you can hit them to stun, but you can also use that to deflect a guard break. So somebody hits you with that, you tap the button immediately, and you don't suffer the stun effect that you would have received beforehand and left you pretty much wide open to a hit. And that's pretty much the basic concept of the Art of Battle system. You have these 3 guards that you transition between. You try to confuse the enemy and get around their guard and break through their guard and things like that. And all that means that the actual combat system is rather skill-based, and there is a pretty high skill ceiling in this game. For example, a really good Orochi player is pretty much unstoppable. Unless, of course, you know how to exploit the weaknesses. So there is actually some interplay between the classes and needing to know what your opponent is capable of and how you can actually counter that with what you have, if you can counter it at all. This leads me to the next point about the Art of Battle system, because the basic controls for it are rather simple, but when you combine that with the fact that each of the various heroes available all have their own movesets, their own combos, and their own special abilities, you get a system that is a lot more dynamic and a lot more varied than you might think just from the basic control scheme. My favorite class so far is the Orochi, which is entirely based around counterattacks. They have a deflect ability where you can time a guard just right to do a quick deflect instead of just absorbing the hit as a hard block or actually going into a full parry, which is when you time the block with a heavy attack at the same time in order to knock the enemy off balance so you can get a free hit. The thing is that a deflect is a lot faster than a parry, and it gives you the option to use a quick counterattack where you just do a quick thrust with your blade instead of actually knocking them off balance and trying to go for a heavy or a light attack or something along those lines. And that does take quite a bit of practice to really start to get down, and a really good Orochi player is capable of not only doing that but also pulling off long combos that allow you to just whittle down the enemy with an incredible amount of ease. Of course, again, you have to know what you're doing with the Orochi to be able to do that, but it really does emphasize the fact that certain characters play wildly differently from one another. There are 4 basic classes available. Those are the Vanguard, the Assassin, the Heavy, and the Hybrid. Hybrids were not available in the closed alpha. They only had Heavies, Vanguards, and Assassins. Vanguards are a fairly medium class. They're pretty well rounded. They're capable of doing a lot of different things. They don't really excel at any one particular thing, though. Those are like the Warden or the Viking Raider. Then, of course, there's the Heavy, where the only example in the closed alpha was the Conqueror, which is the knight wielding a flail and a shield. And they are slow, but they hit really hard and they can take a lot of hits. And then there's the Assassins, which all have a deflect ability, and the only 2 we saw in the alpha were the Orochi and the Berserker, but they are capable of just deflecting attacks and doing quick counterattacks, and basically harassing the enemy with a lot of quick strikes that actually can deal quite a bit of damage. Thing is, they're pretty squishy, so you do need to be careful with them and you need to know what you're doing, and there's the fact that none of them have a passive guard that's only active guards, so they're actually fairly hard to play. And the alpha was only a sampling of 6 of the ultimately 12 characters that we'll be able to mess around with in the full game. But as I mentioned before, each has their own moveset and their own special abilities, so they do actually feel rather different when you get your hands on them and play them. For example, the Viking Raider and the Warden Knight are both Vanguard class, but they play pretty differently. The Raider in particular has a lot of grapple moves that they can do, where they can grab you and drag you off and throw you into a pit, or throw you up against a wall and then stun you by kneeing you in the face, which is really annoying, I might add. Whereas the Warden is more of a general purpose kind of character that does play a bit more defensively. The Raider's more offense while the Warden's more defense, and you end up having a better guard ability than the Raider does, but you don't get quite as good stunning abilities and quite as good offensive capabilities. So it is actually pretty easy to go into this thing and find a character that really suits your individual playstyle. Are you a more defensive player? Are you an all-offense player? Are you a mixture of them? Are you more of a support kind of character? Well, there's probably a character for your playstyle, although there really weren't that many support abilities available in the game. They come in the guise of perks, which you just earn by playing through the actual matches, and as you earn points, you'll unlock these various perks that you can use. Things like stunning all enemies around you in a small radius, or calling in a storm of arrows, or things like that. Abilities that are definitely useful, but I actually didn't see much use in the game because they unlock at a very, very slow rate, and by the time you do get access to them, you are probably just in the middle of a melee, or you don't really need them. So that is something they definitely need to work on. They definitely need more support abilities. They definitely need the perks to be considerably more useful than they are right now. And they could definitely do with making the dual mode more appealing, because as it stands, the Orochi is currently dominant in that mode. Pretty much everyone plays the Orochi when they go into the dual mode, and it actually gets kind of tiring after a while. So maybe they need to put in some additional matchmaking parameters where you can actually choose what you want to play against, or something along those lines. But I'm really not sure how they'd be able to fix that without either breaking the character itself or breaking the mode. You see, the Orochi's only real downside is that it is exclusively for 1v1. If you try to go 2v1 or especially 3 or 4v1 as an Orochi, you are completely screwed. And that leads me to my point about the Art of Battle system that is problematic. It is exclusively designed for 1v1. If you get in a 2-on-1 or 3-on-1 or 4-on-1 fight, then you are at a massive disadvantage. The way they try to mitigate this is giving you a revenge meter that builds up as you take damage, and eventually you can activate the revenge mode, which allows you to do more damage. It basically makes you immune to staggering for a bit, and you can just kind of wail on your enemies and knock them down and things like that with a lot more ease. The problem is that only really evens the playing field a bit if you're in a 2-on-1. If you're on a 3 or 4-on-1, you're just screwed. You need to run away from that. The problem is, if you're in Dominion mode and you're in breaking, then you're probably just screwed anyway. That kind of thing is incredibly frustrating to be on the receiving end of, and again, I'm not sure how they could fix that without fundamentally breaking the characters or the mode itself, or even breaking the Art of Battle system itself. So I guess it's just something we have to live with, because the system itself, when it works, it's pretty brilliant. I would actually argue it's a better system for multiplayer specifically than Mount & Blade's combat system, which is what it most closely resembles. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out in the long run. But once you move past that and you move into things like technical problems, you do find that the matchmaking is spotty at times, and it does run on peer-to-peer right now. Hopefully they'll put in dedicated servers when they do the full version, and the peer-to-peer is just for the beta and alpha periods, but it is something that does come up occasionally. You will have host migrations, you will have lag problems. It really just depends on who's hosting at any given point. It'd be nice to have some sort of lobby or server browser as well, but I guess I can kind of live with matchmaking as long as they do dedicated servers with it. What's harder to live with is the fact that voice chat doesn't work right on the PC version. I don't know about on the console version right now, but on PC, sometimes your voice chat will work, sometimes it won't, and it defaults to mic always being on, so obviously you're going to want to switch it over to push to talk as soon as possible. But even if you have it on always on, sometimes people just won't hear you, and it's pretty confusing as to why they won't be able to hear you, because some people will still be able to hear you, others won't, and then it's just a total crapshoot. So I don't really know what's wrong with the voice chat system, but they definitely need to fix that because communication is pretty important. And then of course they need to sort out UI glitches as well as animation glitches, camera glitches, that sort of thing that aren't really all that important, but they are mildly annoying. But then there's the one thing that I'm just kind of baffled by, and that is the unlock system. Whenever you finish a battle, you get a summary of experience points that you earned for that particular character, and as you level up that character, you're going to be able to get access to different customization options. Things like color palettes that you can swap out for what your armor is going to look like, or you can put in different patterns or images that will be able to be displayed on your armor or your tabards or whatever it may well be, and gives you a pretty good degree of customization. Why so much of that is locked behind levels is completely beyond me, but at least it's all just cosmetic stuff that is locked behind levels, and not actually game-altering stuff. That stuff you just earn by playing the game. After a match you'll possibly get a loot drop, and that will be things like a different blade for your sword, or a different hilt for your sword, or a different piece of your armor that will both look different, at least it can look different from the default, and it will also give you a stat boost or a stat detriment in certain areas. So, for example, a blade might be better at attack power, but be weaker at, say, stamina regeneration, or something along those lines. And I guess the idea there is to help tailor that character to your specific playstyle, but it doesn't seem to have much of an effect at all, and I'm just kind of baffled as to why they put it into the game to begin with if it doesn't have much of an effect. At least the game-altering stuff isn't locked behind ranks or arbitrary leveling systems, it's just based on pure luck as to whether or not you find one. And even then, they still have an in-game currency called Steel that you just earn by playing the game and completing challenges and things like that, in order to allow you to purchase different executions, or purchase different outfits, or maybe you'll try to scavenge loot from the battlefield, or any number of things like that in order to better your character or better your customization options for your characters. And that particular element, at least in its current state, feels like something that was included purely because it's the norm these days ways and not because it actually provides any real benefit to the game as a whole. So either they need to sort that out or just turn all of the items into cosmetic items, in which case I would be fine with unlocking them or using in-game currency to get them or things like that. Because as long as your cosmetic items don't affect your stats and you're not getting any sort of statistical bonuses simply by playing the game longer, I'd be okay with that sort of thing. Thing is that I'm pretty skeptical of that sort of thing these days, so we'll just have to see how that plays out in the long run, I guess. But as it stands, even though there's only a small snippet of the game that we've been able to mess around with in the closed alpha, For Honor is shaping up really nicely. It is a lot of fun when it works really well. Thing is that it doesn't always work really well, namely in the multiple people on one fights, which can get incredibly frustrating, but that's just kind of the name of this particular melee system. And really, your chances drop dramatically when you're in a 2v1 fight, let alone 3 or 4v1 in real life as well as in other video games, so it's really not that surprising, I guess. But I have to say, it is really nice being able to play a game that is blatantly unfinished. Sure, they're still working on a lot of stuff, and it is very obvious that a lot of stuff is being worked on. But it's in such a good state, and it is still so fun to play in its core mechanics alone. So that speaks volumes for the quality of the game overall, and I'm definitely still excited to see how it turns out when the game drops in February. If they perhaps do some beta periods later on down the line and I get a chance to mess around with those, I'll probably do some videos on the beta periods as well if they don't have an NDA or anything like that. But so far, I'm actually very impressed with what Ubisoft has been doing with For Honor, even though it is still definitely rough around the edges. So kudos to the devs for actually making a game that makes me excited to play an Ubisoft game of all things. I will of course be reviewing the full game as soon as I can, but until the next video, thanks for watching.